member and a past history teacher and historian, and he's spoken for us in the past. And today he's speaking about post-election, which we finally have the results of this election, post-election results, how the November 3rd, or was it November, I don't know, 7th, presidential election results will affect our future relationship with Israel. So I welcome Harry. Harry always has really good insights and observations to speak about. And Harry, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you, Tracy, for the opportunity. Thank you, Temple Manual. Thank you, L'chaim, which we try to attend as pre-pandemic, but we also attend virtually. But it's something, one of the things that I miss, and hopefully we'll get back to that soon. The relationship between Israel and the United States has evolved over the years. You know, it started with President Truman, who went out of his way to recognize Israel against the advice of his State Department, against the opposition of his State Department. And though Truman recognized Israel and pressured other countries to do the same, and it was the American pressure that brought forth the United Nations vote, which voted for partition of Palestine, and that brought into being the State of Israel. But Truman, to assuage his State Department and the Defense Department, stopped short of providing any aid to Israel. He did allow private organizations to raise money and send aid to Israel, but that was it. The Eisenhower administration was very much not so friendly to Israel, not so much because of Dwight Eisenhower, because he let his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, handle all of diplomacy and all of foreign relations. And Dulles told the Arab states, we Republicans are not so beholden to the Jewish vote. We don't need the Jewish vote. We don't get the Jewish vote. And we don't have to be as pro-Israel as the Truman administration was. Kennedy was the first one to actually speak about a special relationship between Israel and the United States. And every president since John Kennedy has repeated that. And John Kennedy was the first president to sell military equipment to Israel. President Johnson built on that. President Johnson was very supportive during and after the Six-Day War. I'll say that, a lot of young people today don't remember the Six-Day War or the dangers Israel found itself in. And they just remember Israel as this regional superpower, which Israel is and needs to be, and her well-being depends on that. But she wasn't always the regional superpower. And in fact, she was in grave danger. During the Yom Kippur War, President Nixon, who was didn't have it in his kishkish, so to speak, love of Israel, did come through when they needed an airlift, when they needed emergency military supplies, and they found themselves in a difficult situation of the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War, by the way, was a bigger miracle for Israel than the Six-Day War, because she was attacked on two fronts by more force, a larger number of tanks, a larger number of military equipment than Germany used to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. And that Israel absorbed that at great loss and a great difficulty, and then actually, within about 10 days, actually went from the defensive to the offensive and helped bring that war to an end, was actually a miracle of amazing biblical proportions, as was the Six-Day War, but this one even more. The presidents since then have always spoken about the special relation between Israel and the United States. Now, just to fast forward a bit, when President Obama was elected, he met with Jewish groups at the White House, and he told them that he wanted to create daylight between Israel and the United States. He said that under the Bush administration, this is, W, the younger President Bush, there was no daylight, and therefore we didn't achieve any peace in the Middle East. Well, that wasn't really accurate. There was daylight. They didn't agree on everything. But I think that President Bush had a close relationship with Ariel Sharon. When he was governor of Texas, he visited Israel, and Ariel Sharon took him on a helicopter tour of Israel. And Sharon pointed out, there's the Green Line, and there's the Mediterranean Sea, obviously. And the distance between the Green Line and the Mediterranean Sea was about 9 miles. And Bush said to him, most driveways in Texas are bigger than that. And it had an effect on him. He saw how vulnerable Israel potentially was. And I think, he never really forgot that. But President Obama was one of those. I think there's been two kinds of presidents. There have been presidents who have, kept up the relationship with Israel, but looked at Israel as a burden they'd rather not have or not have to deal with. And then there are presidents who look at Israel as an asset, something that helps out. So Obama, when he tells Jewish leaders that he wants to distance himself from Israel, that sounded ominous. And I'll say one of the campaign themes of President Obama, and of course, Vice President Biden was his running mate. I don't think that their views on Israel were totally aligned, but one of the things that President Obama wanted to do was mend our relations with the Muslim world. And he talked to the Muslim world in his inaugural speech. And he said, you will be remembered for what you build, not what you destroy. In other words, if you're just going to think about destroying Israel, and nothing else, you're not going to progress as much as you might. But he, when he made his first foreign trip first foreign trip was to the Middle East. He went to Saudi Arabia, he went to Turkey, he went to Egypt. In Cairo, Egypt, he gave a speech at the university, one of the oldest universities in the world. And he, distanced himself from Israel. In the first place, he didn't visit Israel on that trip. Unprecedented. You're in the neighborhood, and I didn't come to visit you. If I'm in Newton Center, I'm going to visit you. But here, he didn't. And it was picked up by, it's something you couldn't help but notice in the Arab world and in Israel. During his speech, though, he attacked settlements. He said, he talked about the Holocaust, and it was sort of like the Arab line, the Arab belief either was and has been, modified somewhat now, that Israel was established because somebody had to pay the price for the Holocaust, and that the Arab states and the Arab peoples did nothing to cause the Holocaust. That was Christian Europe, that was Christian Germany, and they shouldn't have to pay the price and sacrifice Palestine. So he talked about the Holocaust and how it actually happened, how terrible it was, but it sort of fed into that narrative. He did state in that speech that the bonds between the United States and Israel were unbreakable. Now, every time he criticized Israel on settlements and other things, it brought the house down. when he talked about the bonds between the United States and Israel being unbreakable, there was total silence. But that was his audience. We learned later that his assistant national security advisor, Ben Rhodes, not the national security advisor, the assistant, was 28 years old at the time. And to me, 28 seems pretty young. He advised him not to go to Israel. He talked him out of it. He said, it'll be like, business as usual. So you shouldn't do it because we're going to have to come down hard on Israel, and don't make it look like, we're too buddy-buddy with them. And then, of course, part of repairing our relations with the Muslim world is to distance yourself from Israel. The less cozy you are with Israel, the more friendly you might be with them. Actually, that doesn't work that way, because Anwar Sadat had learned that the road to peace and the road to recovering lost territory ran through Washington, not through Moscow and not through Western Europe, through Washington. And you have to cozy up to Washington to have influence with Israel. So the closer the relationship between the US and Israel is, the more you're going to get done. The more Israel will be attuned to your desires or what you feel are your needs. Now, Joe Biden goes back, was 40 years in the Senate, and was 8 years as vice president, almost 40 years in the Senate. And his first foreign trip was to Israel, and he met with Golda Meir, and he spoke fondly with her. And during this past campaign, when he was speaking in front of a Jewish audience, he said, I'm the only candidate who can do a motzi. So his kids have all married Jewish spouses. And you can say that by Jewish law, his grandchildren are Jewish. You can say that for some of President Trump's grandchildren. You can say that about the grandchildren of the Clintons. But I think Biden has it in his kishki, so to speak, this affection for Israel. I don't think it would be a continuation of the Obama administration. Now, the Obama administration came down hard on settlements. They didn't want a cutback. They wanted a total freeze, a total stopping of construction. And, when Israel withdrew from Gaza, there was a deal between Ariel Sharon and President Bush that the US, and the US put it in writing, that the US would recognize the settlement blocks that are in the West Bank. And the settlement blocks, which are over 90% of the settlers, the settlement blocks mean East Jerusalem. It means, the blocks, the settlements that are right adjacent to the Green Line. So in other words, under Clinton, the Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians 97% of the West Bank. Not only because most of the settlements and most of the settlers were on that 3% of the West Bank. And they didn't get a yes, they didn't get a no, they didn't get a counteroffer. And, I think Clinton got exasperated with Yasser Arafat and so forth. But anyways, the Bush administration put that in writing, that the settlement blocks had to be recognized as facts on the ground, and it wasn't practical to shift almost 500,000 Israeli settlers back across the Green Line. And Israel, for its part, withdrew from Gaza, and the US recognized that as a major step. The Obama administration, when they came in, said they couldn't find that. They didn't know about that, and they couldn't, and even though it was in writing, they couldn't find the documents, which is, I don't know, I thought a bit much. And when Vice President Biden was in Israel, the Israelis made the mistake. It wasn't Netanyahu who authorized it, but it was the housing ministry that authorized some new housing construction. And they did it while Biden was visiting, and he was there to, reassure Israel. He was there as, they knew him as a longtime friend. And the Obama administration went berserk. They said that it insulted the vice president. Netanyahu apologized to Biden. Biden accepted the apology, but Obama didn't. He said Israel didn't appreciate its relationship with the United States. And, he hinted that things might have to they might have to rethink things. And part of that was the advice from Rahm Emanuel, who was chief of staff. Rahm Emanuel said, never waste a crisis. If you have a crisis, make the most out of it and use it to your advantage and use it to get concessions. So I think he was following that advice. And I think, other things, Netanyahu once coming to the US was in the air on the way to the US, still in his plane. And Obama announced that US policy was that negotiations with the Palestinians would have to be based on the 67 ceasefire lines. And, mind you, these were not borders, they were ceasefire lines. They ended the 48-49 war. The Arabs didn't agree to borders because they didn't recognize Israel. So you don't have borders because I don't even recognize your existence. And Netanyahu thought, what a slap in the face. That was something we were supposed to negotiate. And here you're undercutting our negotiating position. And when he came to the White House, he had been reluctant to speak out against or to criticize President Obama, but he gave a lecture to the president in front of everybody there. And Obama took that, not wrongfully so, as a diplomatic insult. And their relationship never totally recovered from that. Vice President Biden, during the campaign, has said that he's going back to the Iran deal. The Iran deal is extremely problematic. President Obama let it be known. Iran, he wasn't sure what to do about Iran. He did institute sanctions against Iran, but Congress placed even stiffer sanctions on Iran. And it was those congressional sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table. The Obama administration had opposed those sanctions. It opposed the congressional sanctions. You will go with the milder White House sanctions. And I'll say this about the Iran deal. The two things wrong with it. One, it wasn't really a setback for Iran. It was just a delay. And President Obama let it be known that all he wanted to do, he didn't want Iran to have a nuclear bomb. That's true, I'm sure of that. But he just wanted to kick it down the road. He didn't want it during his administration. And he didn't want it in the next administration when Hillary Clinton was supposed to become president. And it'll come to a head in 2025, which isn't that far away. We're almost to 2021. In 2025, Iran can start everything up again, legally. So all they got was, and that's called the sunset clause. And so all they got was a delay. And the Iranians didn't have to destroy any nuclear equipment. They didn't have to close anything down. They didn't have to really do much except for stop producing, fissionable material you need to build nuclear weapons. They didn't have to cut back on their missile program. They didn't have to amend their behavior in the Middle East, the support for terrorism. They didn't have to cut back their calls for death to Israel, and that Israel must be destroyed. None of that was required. Just delay your nuclear deal. And sanctions were lifted totally. And it's true that the Iranians had money in US banks, which were frozen since Jimmy Carter. And they wanted an immediate delivery of, I think, $400 million by plane in crisp bills in 20s. And that was done. And then other funds were released, which amounted to about $1.5 billion. And within that deal, also, the Iranians, who said that they're very much worried about their dignity. If somebody wanted to inspect any of their nuclear sites, they needed 24 days notice. And if they didn't agree that you should inspect it even after 24 days, then the request to inspect one of their sites would have to go to arbitration. And then they didn't say whether arbitration would be binding. So that's the deal. And it was extremely generous to Iran. Iran didn't really give up much, but it allowed them to kick the ball down the road, the can down the road. And the hope, it was a hope, a wink, and a prayer that Iran would just change its behavior in the 10 years. From 2015 to 2025, they would see with sanctions lifted and the benefits of being part of the world again, they would see that, they could modify some of their behavior, some of their attitudes toward Israel, or even modify their movement to a nuclear weapon. It didn't really, the first, what we've seen so far, which is almost 6 years since then, it didn't work out that way. The Trump administration said openly what a bad deal that was, and they really clamped heavy sanctions on Iran. It's still a question of whether President Trump will clamp even stronger sanctions on Iran in the time he has left till January 20th. If President-elect Biden has said he's going back to the deal, but he'd like to strengthen it. The Iranians have said nothing doing. In fact, we need a better deal because you have to compensate us for the time that the US left the deal. So whether he can really come to a deal with Iran remains to be seen, but he will be much more agreeable to a deal with Iran, which doesn't make the Arab states happy. It doesn't make the Gulf states happy. Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates or the others, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, who look at Shiite Iran as a danger, a threat. That's why they have sort of cozied up to Israel, because their feeling is Israel is the other superpower here, and Israel can stand up to Iran right now. Israel feels that if they're going to have to do battle with Iran, better to do it now than later. And that's why Israel will not allow Iran to establish a foothold in Syria. And the Israelis have consistently attacked their bases or infrastructure in Syria whenever they've tried to establish that. Now, it's not a perfect cure. They've been establishing themselves in Lebanon and in Syria, and then through proxies through Hezbollah and other militias. But President Trump has sort of backed up the Israelis on that. I will say that President Trump is a bit unpredictable. When the Iranians shot down an American drone, the military wanted the Air Force to destroy that base from which the missiles were fired to shoot down the American drone over international waters, by the way. And in the air, they were called back. Tucker Carlson from Fox News got in touch with President Trump, or President Trump got in touch with him, I don't know. And Tucker Carlson told him, if you bomb Iran, say goodbye to your reelection. In which case the pilots were recalled after being in the air 10 minutes and almost to their target. Even worse than that, the Iranians and the Saudis are fighting this proxy war in Yemen. And in Yemen, the Saudis support the traditional government, the monarchy, and the Iranians support the Houthis, who are more closely aligned to the Shiites. And the Iranians said that it was the Houthis who fired missiles and cruise missiles and precision missiles at Saudi Arabian oil fields, at the mechanism that controls all the pumping of the oil out of the ground. And Secretary of State Pompeo called that an act of war, which is what it was. And the price of oil jumped up and Saudi production was stopped. And everybody knew it was the Iranians. They were amazed that the Iranians could hit that site with 85% accuracy. In other words, 85% of their missiles fired at that site hit their targets square, right on bullseye. And everybody knew the Houthi rebels in Yemen do not have that kind of sophistication or weaponry. Secretary Pompeo wanted to strike back at Iran. There were all kinds of screams in Congress. We got to limit the powers of the president to cause trouble with Iran and so forth. And in the end, he didn't do anything, which was very encouraging to Iran. But then later, he did, last January, he killed the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, General Soleimani, with an airstrike, and that surprised the Iranians. So they really realized what a lot of other people have realized: President Trump is unpredictable in many ways. You don't know when he's going to react, and you don't know when he's not going to react. But I will say that when he made his first foreign trip to the outside of the country, he went first to Saudi Arabia, and then he flew directly to Jerusalem. And he made a point of that. And for the first time, an American president was able to visit Israel by flying over Saudi Arabian airspace. They permitted that, which, I mean, they used to be at the forefront of anti-Israel front. Again, but of late, they're in the moderate, wing, especially the Crown Prince. And I'll say that President Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he was told by other world leaders and by Secretary of State Tillerson that that would be an earthquake in the world. People were going to die because of that. Well, President Truman was told the same thing. If you recognize Israel, the world's going to come to an end. President Johnson was told, if you don't force Israel to withdraw from the Sinai or the West Bank, the world's going to come to an end. I mean, presidents have always been told that kind of thing, and that didn't work. I will say that when you move the embassy to Jerusalem, that's significant in many ways, because Israel was the only country in the world that wasn't allowed to choose its capital. And somehow, if you're not allowed to choose your capital, you're a little less legitimate. Can you imagine saying to the French, we don't recognize that Paris is your capital. It's such a beautiful international city. It belongs to all of us. You can go there, but you can't make it your capital. If we ever said that to the Italians about Rome or to the British about London, Or if somebody said that to us about Washington, D.C., you can't imagine. Also, he recognized Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights, because he said you can't give that area back to Hafez al-Assad, who murdered his own people and has committed atrocities, used poison gas on his own people. So, in a way, President Trump was considered so pro-Israel. I'm hoping that there isn't an anti-Trump feeling that we have to become the other way. I think President Trump was the anti-Obama. I don't want President Biden to be the anti-Trump in terms of foreign policy toward Israel. But I don't think that President Biden will follow exactly the course of President Obama. And I'll give you an example. During the transition period, the Obama administration fostered a resolution in the United Nations condemning all Israeli settlements. They called them totally illegal and totally invalid. And that included even the Kotel, every inch of it. And Vice President Biden was against that resolution. And Secretary of State Kerry was very much for that resolution. So was the United Nations Ambassador Samantha Powers. And Obama said, well, let's compromise. We won't vote for that resolution, even though we put it forward. We got New Zealand and other countries to put it forward, New Zealand and Senegal. We won't vote for it, we'll just abstain. And of course, all those anti-Israel countries at the Security Council will vote for it. So it passed because the US abstained. It was easy to say we didn't vote for it, we didn't vote against it, almost like saying, we didn't support Germany's aggression in World War II or their atrocity, but we didn't oppose it either. When you turn your back on it, sometimes terrible things happen. But anyways, Vice President Biden was very much against doing that. He counseled against it, but he didn't prevail. So I think that Israel, which during the Trump administration didn't build a lot of settlements, they didn't get a lot of pushback, but they built more of them under the Obama administration than they did the Trump administration. And I don't think that they will build much during the Biden years, the coming Biden years. I think, Biden at one time said to Netanyahu, Bibi, I don't agree with a thing you say, not a single thing. However, I do love you. And I think that there will be some of that. At times they may be frenemies. But I think, and I'll say, I thought it was very important when Bernie Sanders, who gave a kosher hecture to being anti-Israel, he said, that's condition A to Israel, that if they don't do exactly as we say, we'll cut off military aid to them. Israel doesn't get any economic aid from the US. They only get military aid. And candidate Biden said that was bizarre and crazy and as counterproductive as anything could possibly ever be. And, think of the Arab states ever negotiating with Israel if the US totally cut off aid, if Israel was weakened. The Israelis once said to Henry Kissinger, they will not negotiate with a weak Israel. They'll only negotiate with a strong Israel. So they need to be strong, strength through peace through strength. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to totally get your way, but you have to be willing to compromise. And the other side has not been willing to compromise. The Biden administration will try to restart negotiations with the Palestinians. But I'll tell you that, by the way, today, Saeb Erekat, who was their chief negotiator, passed away. He was at times moderate. By the way, he went for treatment at an Israeli hospital. He was at the Hadassah hospital in Jerusalem. He had lung problems always, and I think when he got COVID-19, I think that was too much. And he arrived in very serious condition. Unfortunately, today he passed away. But he did talk about a two-state solution, and he did, though at the same time, he did want to get Israel prosecuted in the International Court for war crimes. So he was often there demonizing Israel on one hand and talking about potentially coming to an agreement. But I'll say though the Biden administration will try to restart negotiations with the Palestinians, there are two things that have always stopped negotiations dead in their tracks. And that has been two positions on the parts of the Palestinians. From the Israeli side, you can always talk, we'll keep this settlement, we won't keep that settlement, we'll trade you land in pre-67 Israel for something in the West Bank. There'll be land swaps, there'll be negotiations, compensation, this, that, whatever. But the Palestinians have two positions that they have never backtrack on. One is they want all the descendants of Palestinian refugees, who number between 5 and 6 million, to go back to Israel. And you can call it Israel if you want, but they've got to live in Israel. They've never seen Israel, some of them, but they've got to settle in Israel. And there are 2.5 million Arab citizens, full citizens of Israel now. And if you add another 5 or 6 million, they become the majority. And then they can vote Israel out of existence. So that they've never compromised on that. They've sort of been coy. Well, that's our position, so forth, but they never backtracked from that. And they've never been willing to end the conflict. The Israelis have always said that part of any agreement is a clause where all your claims against us are over and the conflict is ended. The Palestinian response to that was, no, they're not, and we want a war guilt clause. Now, the war guilt clause is what they slapped on Germany after the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, 1919, that the First World War was all the fault of Germany. So the Palestinians have not been willing to compromise even one iota on those conditions. And I think it's been an Israeli mistake to say, they should say, well, let's first pass that hurdle. All the descendants, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren of the Palestinian refugees are not coming back to Israel. Or some of them might come back in some condition or whatever. But they're not automatically taking them all back. So that's the impasse we have. I would say, the Israelis have had a very easy 4 years with President Trump. He has been, he has done things that other presidents haven't done. But at the same time, you can make an argument that, he's done other things. Obviously, there are plenty of complaints about President Trump, and that there was no guarantee that he was going to be reelected. And we want to guard against, a backlash. Support for Israel has always been bipartisan. And for people who care about Israel, that has to be maintained. I know there are wings of the Democratic Party that are very anti-Israel. Ilhan Omar, who has said a lot of anti-Semitic things, and she gets a pass. She's protected from that because she's a woman of color, and you can't openly criticize her, or if you do, she can't be censured. She can't be. You can't have a resolution. Even attacking what she says, because that will put her in danger. So her latest thing is defund Israel. Remember, defund the police? So most recently, a new thing is defund Israel. Things that she said is like, it's all about the Benjamins. There are people who want you to swear allegiance to a foreign country. and we know what foreign country that is. And the implication is you don't care about America. You've got dual loyalties. You care more about that country and this country. And I'm a real American. That I agree with her on. She is a real American, totally. But so are other people. And because they care about Israel, they're no less real Americans. There's a wing of the party, and actually even Kamala Harris. I didn't know this. There's an organization called Move On, and they have set their targets on AIPAC, as has Ilhan Omar, and they've asked Democratic candidates to announce that they're not going to speak at AIPAC. Because AIPAC was against the Iran deal. AIPAC, they say, is a right-wing organization, which it isn't. It's bipartisan. It's just an extension of Netanyahu and the occupation. I put the occupation in quotes. That's the head of that organization is her chief of staff. That doesn't mean Kamala Harris is not adversely opposed to Israel. She has actually a very short record. She hasn't been in the Senate very long, but she was one of the senators who signed the letter criticizing the Obama administration's support or abstention in the United Nations for that resolution condemning Israeli settlements. And by the way, that resolution set the stage for the United Nations saying you have to differentiate between products built in Israel and products built in the West Bank. She was against that resolution. But I'd say the so-called progressives, the far left wing of the Democratic Party is louder than anybody else. They're newer than anybody else. They don't really have the seniority, but they're sort of know-it-alls, and they're pushing an anti-Israeli agenda. And Bernie Sanders has sort of given them a cover for it because he agrees with a lot of that. And he'll tell you that he's Jewish. And, I mean, he doesn't broadcast that, but if he can use that against Israel or gain points with the far left, he'll do that. So, don't call us anti-Semitic because Bernie Sanders, who is Jewish, agrees with us. So, that's their, latest target is AIPAC. Before that, their latest target was Birthright. And even when I have a nephew who went on Birthright for the first time, had to be lectured while on that trip on why on the Palestinian narrative, which is fine, but I don't think Palestinians are lectured about the Israeli or Jewish narrative. Okay, but anyways, there's much more I could have said, or I've always taken notes. I like to talk without my notes, and I'll entertain questions or comments or disagreements or anything. Agreements are also welcome.
Thank you, Harry. This was really wonderful. I'm just, Samantha, I'm wondering if you could help unmute everybody. So if people want to ask questions, or if you just want to ask a question directly, that would be great. And then, so anybody have any questions for Harry? I actually have some questions that I wrote down, Harry, if no one else does. Well, this is just more of a comment. Alexandria, I call her AOC, right? AOC with Bernie Sanders. I think, her what's the word? Strength is social media. And she gets on social media with all the, the young people, the 20-year-olds, the teenagers. And sometimes she's not even talking about politics. She's just talking about fashion or, something like that. And I think she's pulling people in by that. It's very clever on her part. But the anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian debate, again, more of the young people, Jewish young people, are questioning some of what the older generation has set before them. And I think that this is on her end, it's a tactic to, she's using social media to reach out. That's just a comment. The other thing I want to ask you is Jared Kushner. What, in your opinion, if Jared Kushner was not married to Trump's daughter, do you think that Trump would have had as much pro, like moving the embassy or some of the other things that he's done? If Kushner was not in the picture, what is your opinion of if Trump would have done all this without Kushner?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think Jared Kushner had influence on him as much as people can have influence on him. President Trump would always say that he's his own best advisor. He doesn't always listen to people. And we hear, we never know the whole story, the story behind the story. We hear that Jared Kushner has told him the better, proper thing to do would be to concede the election now and to wish Joe Biden well and to have a smooth transition, that would be better for his legacy. He doesn't seem to be doing that. But I'd say that President Trump had also Ambassador Friedman, the U.S. ambassador in Israel, who was his attorney here in the U.S. on real estate, is also very pro-Israel. I think some of that maybe he had it. It's hard to know because President Trump doesn't write a lot. He hasn't, he's ghostwritten books, The Art of the Deal and things like that, but he doesn't put a lot of things down on paper. I will say one thing about President-elect Biden. The Democratic platform, AOC and the so-called squad, wanted to put in the Democratic platform statements against the occupation. Mm. And Joe Biden had that removed, would not permit that, stood firm on that. We can talk about negotiations and a peace and give and take from both sides, but to throw in that word occupation, that's a polarizing word. That's like a lightning rod. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's a very good sign.
Harry, you mentioned that in your opinion, Trump, has November, December, and part of January left, that you think that he might impose some more sanctions on Iran during that time.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts and takeaway about that?
Yeah, there's talk about that. Normally, you would have a transition with the new administration, and you'd work out some policies together. Obama, on terms of foreign policy, did not have that smooth transition with the Trump people. So when that resolution went forward in the United Nations, President-elect Trump at the time was very much against it. Mm. And he had convinced the Egyptians to withdraw that resolution. And Obama just went to other countries, notably Senegal and New Zealand, to reintroduce it. So there wasn't a smooth transition on that foreign policy thing. Normally they would say to the Biden people, well, we're thinking of doing this. Iran, for its part, though, would say, well, we've withstood severe economic sanctions. If he ups the notch a little bit, if he increases them even more, all we have to do is survive for 2.5 months. And we can do that. Mm. And they're not going to capitulate. They deserve to have sanctions put on them. Their economy is almost at the collapse level, but they will not give up their nuclear program. And I'll say a former Israeli chief of intelligence said, Iran is going to get the bomb. No country who went for nuclear weapons has ever been deterred. Not North Korea, not Pakistan, not China, not India, no one. And he said to deter them or to stop them, you'd essentially almost have to hit them hard or invade them. And nobody's going to do that. He said, not even Israel's going to do that. So he says, in the end, they're going to get it. If they're determined, and they are determined. But what we can do and what we have to do, the only avenue that's open to us, because neither Israel nor the U.S. will do anything about it. The U.S. is the only country that could stop them in their tracks. But I don't think the U.S. is willing to go that far. is we'd have to say to Iran, both the US and Israel, if you ever drop a nuclear device on a friendly country, it'll be the end of your country. That would deter them, but nothing else. They only know weakness and strength. They don't know anything in between. And, you know, he said we would just always have to be vigilant against them. But that, you know, and that's a precarious position to be in. The Iranians have said we're willing to lose, you know, half our population to destroy Israel, and that we don't need as many bombs as they need. So, do they really mean it? I tend to think no, but maybe, or maybe some people in their government mean it. So, my guess is that stronger sanctions on Iran is probably 50-50, but I wouldn't be surprised if we don't slap them with anything stronger, and that President Trump for the remaining 2.5 months will probably sort of stay low. I don't think he'll do much on anything. You know, this is hard for him to absorb, this loss.
Right. Anyone have any questions or comments? Anyone want to ask anything? So I have one more question if no one else is going to ask.
Sure.
How is Biden going to, he's moderate. How is he, if he makes decisions about anything to do with Israel, and you've got that left, the extreme left pulling on him, pulling, you know, go this way, and he's trying to stay more moderate. How does he work that balance? I mean, he doesn't want to upset the squad group, but he also wants to play to, you know, the more moderate followers. So how does he work that delicate balance?
Yeah, I think he will let them talk. I mean, how can you stop them from talking? They're just very loud. Normally, when you're new in Congress for your first couple of terms anyway, you sort of lay low, learn the ropes, you know, get people to mentor you. They didn't. They came in like they were co-presidents.
Right.
And, you know, I think that's the way they're going to be. I was disappointed that Nancy Pelosi endorsed Ilhan Omar. I just thought that it would have been better if she didn't say anything. You know, she endorsed her for re-election. I don't think they'll have that much influence on President Biden, who really is moderate. And before he was maybe centrist, and now maybe he's been pushed slightly to the left of center, but he's still mostly centrist. And I think the Republicans would love to brand the Democratic Party as those socialists. Mm-hmm. You know, and so I think, you know, they will have their day. I think when they wanted to make a trip to Israel, I think it was a mistake on the Netanyahu government to not let them in, because they were members of Congress. You know, they should have been allowed to go anywhere they wanted, talk to anybody you want to talk to, ask them to go to Yad Vashem, which they might have refused, but that's okay. You know, we would have pointed that out. They might have gone to Yad Vashem and said something like, well, this is what you're doing to the Palestinians. You know, you don't know. But I think it was President Trump who asked Netanyahu not to let them in, and Netanyahu felt he couldn't say no. Mm. So I think in the future, when they want to make a trip, I think especially under President Biden, they'll be allowed to do that. There's a lot of pushback there. I will say that the much of Congress in both parties is very pro-Israel. Steny Hoyer is chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, very pro-Israel, and Chuck Schumer, you know, the Democratic leader in the Senate, and Steny Hoyer, the Democratic leader in the House. But you know, they're older.
Right. And that's what I'm saying. It's generational.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful to keep nurturing that relationship, especially with younger people. And one of the ways to do that is, I think AIPAC always brings people to Israel. And when they go to Israel, they automatically go to the West Bank. They often go to Jordan. They often go to Egypt. But, you know, they make those trips. Bernie Sanders, I thought, was a bit much. It's like, you know, if I made an announcement that I'm not going to the inaugural ball in Washington, D.C., well, I wasn't invited. So why do I say that? Why do I have to say I'm boycotting it? You know, I can say I'm boycotting it. Well, Bernie Sanders wasn't invited to speak at AIPAC, but he made a point of making you know, a special news conference and a special announcement that he refuses to speak in front of them. You know, so you know, I think that I'm glad that, you know, he's probably on the way out. I would say, you know, I didn't mean for my talk to be an anti-Bernie Sanders talk, but I know that Barney Frank said of Bernie Sanders, where were you for 35 years? When you turned 75, you woke up and you decided it's time to run for president. We never heard from you before. Most people in the country didn't even know who he was. Most people cannot rattle off who the senators from Vermont are. You know, so, you know, I think, in my opinion, it's just my opinion, for what that's worth, you know, he's a bit disingenuous on many fronts.
So you're very hopeful. You're very hopeful that Biden's relationship with Israel will be a hopeful one.
Yeah, I am hopeful, and I do think it won't veer very much from you know, recent Democratic administrations. You know, I will say this: you know, the Obama administration did make a memorandum of understanding with Israel that they would get $3.8 billion a year in military aid for 10 years straight. Now, if there wasn't the tussle over Iran, that might have been even a larger amount. But, you know, that was started by the younger President Bush. And it was very important that a Democratic administration continue that. And I think when that's up, whether we have a Democratic or a Republican administration, I think that will be renewed. And that's important, you know, that we maintain the relationship. I'm not worried about President Obama. And I think it's going to take some work to make sure that kind of, by President Biden, and it's going to take some work to make sure that in the future administrations think along similar lines.
All right. Any questions? Anybody have a question or a comment? No?
Thank you all for zooming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Harry. This was wonderful. Thank you for the hour. We really appreciate it. And Harry comes every year. We have Harry Tillinger.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great job.
Can I just, next week for L'chaim, same time.
Well, very interesting. Thank you.
Next week at 1 o'clock, we have Rick Scalise. He's a classical pianist. If you've been to Emmanuel and have heard him, you know he's top notch. So I hope that you all zoom in next week at 1 o'clock. And this Thursday, we have Zumba with Ketty from 1 to 2. And if you've never done the Zumba, you can try it. You can just stay in your chair if you don't want to stand. And she's wonderful. She reaches out to everybody. She's very personable. Some of you know her from the Senior Center as well. And following that at 2 o'clock, we have a talk about Marc Chagall, and we're going to do an art project, part of our Artful Afternoons this Thursday. So I hope everyone comes in at 1 o'clock for Zumba and stays for Artful Afternoons from 2 to 3. And thank you for attending. And we'll see you also next Tuesday, November 17th for L'chaim. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much, Harry.
Hi.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi. Great job.
Hi, neighbor.
Enjoy it.
Hi. Good. All right. Bye, everybody.
Good to see everybody.
Hi, Judy. Thank you, Harry and Minna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
everybody.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Thanks, Tracy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Sylvia. I don't see you, but I know you're there. Hi, Sylvia. Hi, Yael. Hi, Nancy.
Yes, beautiful. Minna, hi. Cheryl.
Hi, Judy.
Hi, how are you? So good to see you.
I know, it's nice
Molly,
to see you.
I see you. Oh, it's great.
What the treat is about seeing everyone on Zoom.
It is nice.
Harry and Minna, how are your grandchildren?
Grandkids are good. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
That's our favorite.
Yeah, that's what makes COVID, bearable.
Yeah.
Wow. Did a great job, Harry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Enjoyed it.
I see you. Thanks for
Yes,
Susan.
and,
Good to see you.
Good to see everybody.
Yeah, Alex, you're back there somewhere.
Good to
All
see
right.
you.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Billy, you look wonderful.
Thanks, Minna.
Bye-bye.
Bye.